Hey everyone, if you're in my class, we are wrapping up our unit on World War I and the interwar period, and we're going to finish up with looking at the rise of totalitarianism in Europe and the dictators that personified that movement, that being Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. So if you're in my class, pay close attention, because not only will this help you understand the effects of World War I more clearly, but also will lay the groundwork for our study of World War II. So by the end of the video, be able to explain why countries were vulnerable to having totalitarian dictators take power in the 1920s and 1930s, and be able to identify and describe what Mussolini, Stalin, and Hitler did in their countries to reflect totalitarian ideals. Also, a lot of terms to define in this one. If I were you, I'd pause this video and write those terms down and then define them as we go through the video to make sure you have those down in preparation for the test. So first, introduction of what totalitarianism actually is. Obviously, the root word there is totality or total. So totalitarian governments share all of these characteristics. One is a dictator that's in power that wields a large amount of authority and power and influence over the entire country. There is typically state or government control of the economy in some way, shape, or form, use of terror and police forces to maintain order and scare and intimidate opposition. There's often censorship of the media. We don't want the opposition getting out if you're a totalitarian ruler. And also the use of education in schools to indoctrinate young people, to foster young followers so that when they become older, they'll continue your beliefs and your ideals. So Europe is a breeding ground for that type of ruler in the 1920s and 1930s. A lot of that is because of World War I. There's a great deal of anger and disillusionment in Europe after World War I because of all the death and destruction. And in Germany, there's a great deal of disillusionment because they had lost the war and believed they were far too powerful to have actually been defeated. In Italy, they're upset because they had been promised land after the war by the other major powers at the Paris Peace Conference, and then they didn't get it, so they felt they'd been stabbed in the back. There's a great deal of economic decline because of the war, a lot of despair among the people, made even worse in 1929 with the Great Depression, which is not just in America, but really a worldwide phenomenon. And also weak and very vulnerable governments that had been put in place right after World War I, especially in Germany, where the Weimar Republic was set up, but wasn't able to fix the problems that plagued Germany, and that gives rise to Hitler and the Nazis. So we will start by looking at Benito Mussolini, who was the dictator of Italy. He is the first of these three guys to take power that we're going to talk about today. He had been a soldier for Italy during World War I, and after the war began giving political speeches at meetings and really got people riled up when he talked about his dream of restoring Italian glory. You know, you think about Italy, you think of Rome and the Roman Empire back thousands of years ago, and he really thought that Italy should be that powerful again. And this got the people pretty fired up and excited. And over time, he was able to get together a group of very loyal followers known as black shirts. And you see a picture of them there at the top. In 1922, he got a group of his black shirts together and led what he called a March on Rome, where he demanded more power for his group. And the King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, actually made him the Prime Minister. So he was able to establish his power in Italy without actually leading any kind of revolt or revolution. And the government that he ends up setting up is fascist. Fascism is a political philosophy that demands obedience to the country. Everything that is done is for the good of the state or for the good of the government. And over time, he consolidates absolute power within Italy as a very, very strong central leader, with the black shirts obviously there to help him enforce and maintain power. He becomes known as Il Duce, which is Italian for the leader or the chief. So a quick look at some of the things Mussolini actually did within Italy. Again, he takes control of the economy, and the economy does recover some in the 1920s. Things get a little better after the war, but at the expense of the workers. The workers don't make very much money, and they don't have very good working conditions. But again, in fascism, the important thing is not the individual. The important thing is the country. Gender roles became very strongly defined. Males were encouraged to be strong warriors for the country. That could be as an industrial worker who helps economically, or it could be as an actual soldier. Women were encouraged to be mothers. Mussolini referred to this as the Battle of Motherhood. And the idea was that if you have large families, you are breeding future Italians who will grow up to worship and idolize this idea of a strong Italy and a fascist government. Mussolini would personally award medals to women who bore more than, get ready for this, 14 children. And he gave out quite a few of those, actually, so imagine that. Speaking of children, they were indoctrinated from a very early age. They were taught from a very early time in school to be obedient to the government. And you see a picture of a group of young boys there already in military uniform. And of course the idea is if they are so patriotic and so loyal to Mussolini and the Italian state when they're this young, when they grow up, they'll be even more so. And that's obviously important as World War I rolls around. Or, I'm sorry, World War II rolls around in the late 1930s, early 1940s. Okay, on to Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. Stalin was not his birth name. He took that later. Stalin means man of steel in Russian, so trying to project an aura of strength. He took over the Soviet Union in 1924 when Lenin died. It took him about 3 years after Lenin's death to consolidate power. He had to essentially win it over another high-ranking Soviet official named Leon Trotsky. Over time, Stalin was able to convince most of the other influential people in the Soviet government that Lenin wanted him to take power, even though Lenin, in his memoirs, actually expressed a little bit of skepticism and wariness about Stalin. But under Lenin and then under Stalin, the Soviet Union undergoes a change from being a communist state, remember where communism is the idea of workers controlling everything. That's how it started off, but it very, very, very quickly changed into a dictatorship along the lines of what Mussolini had in Italy. So in the Soviet Union, there was some economic development. Stalin installed what he called 5-year plans. The idea was to build up industry, make farm production a bigger priority because there were still a lot of people starving in Russia after the war. Peasants were forced to give up their own private land. They could keep their houses and some of their property, but instead of having their own farms to till, they had to join what were called collectives, which were these big, huge tracts of land where everyone worked together. And there's actually a picture of that on the bottom of this slide. You see, I think 8 or so people combining their equipment to work on this one giant farm. Now, this doesn't make a lot of people very happy. Peasants were pretty upset about losing their land, but if you resisted, you were sent to a work camp known as a gulag out in Siberia. This helps to modernize Russia industrially a little bit, but food shortages actually remain a major problem in Russia despite collectivization in the 1930s. Elimination of opposition is something that Stalin is very well known for better or worse. In the 1930s, he sort of saw enemies everywhere and began to initiate what he called purges, or eliminating his enemies. That could be generals who he thought weren't loyal enough to him. It could be government officials who had spoken out against him. Opponents would be put on trial and executed. They were almost always found guilty, or they might be sent to the gulags in Siberia. One example of a general being sent away is the Commissar Nikolai Yezhov, who you see standing with Stalin in the late 1930s in the picture on top. But after he ran afoul of Stalin and fell out of favor with him, he was put to death, and his existence was officially scrubbed by the Soviet Union. As you can see there, he was whatever the 1940s equivalent of Photoshop was. He was taken out. Stalin may have encouraged absolute obedience by doing these purges, but it's going to hurt when World War II rolls around because he ends up killing off his best generals. Finally, with Germany, Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler fought in World War I. He joined the National Socialist, or Nazi Party, after the war, and rose through the ranks pretty quickly. He was a very good public speaker, and was able to get people to buy into his viewpoints. And in 1923, he had been inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, and he attempts to seize power in Munich in an event called the Beer Hall Putsch, because it's this attempted uprising that began at a bar or a beer garden in Munich, Germany. But it failed, and he was put on trial for treason, and he was convicted. But a lot of people, even in the government, in the judicial system, sort of sympathized with what Hitler had been saying about the government that was in place, the Weimar government, because it was very weak. The economy was terrible in the early 1920s in Germany. You know, a loaf of bread that had cost 1 mark a year later would cost like trillions of marks because of hyperinflation. So things were really, really horrible. So despite the fact that Hitler was found guilty of treason, he was essentially put in quote-unquote prison in this castle out in the countryside. And while he was there, he had his own personal servant and everything, and he wrote this book called Mein Kampf, which translates from German as My Struggle. And in it, he spouts about his beliefs. He says that Germany is not to blame for losing World War I. They were essentially stabbed in the back by business leaders and their own government, and that Jews and communists had infiltrated the government and weakened Germany to the point where they lost the war. He also said that Germans are the master race, and they need what he called Lebensraum, which translates as living space. So the idea was that Germany needed to branch out, to stretch out as it were, so that this master race could have space to grow and prosper. And that's going to lay the groundwork for the late 1930s when Hitler begins to conquer neighboring countries in Europe. So Hitler is actually elected the Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Of these 3 dictators we've talked about, he is the one that is legally elected using actual constitutional procedures that were in place in Germany at the time. When he was elected, he proclaimed what he called a Third Reich, or empire. The First Reich, in his mind, was the Holy Roman Empire of medieval times, which was an era of German glory, you could say. The Second Reich was the newly unified Germany that Bismarck created in the 1870s. He saw his new government as this third amazing empire that was going to last for a very long time. The Great Depression had hit in the late 1920s, sort of played into Hitler's hands because he was able to convince people that things were horrible and that under him things would be better. So he launched public works projects to get people working again, and did actually manage to improve the economy in Germany. One example of those works projects is the Autobahns. You probably heard of those. They're famous in America for being speed limit-free highways in Germany. And they're very similar to the interstate system in the United States. It actually, the Autobahns inspired Dwight D. Eisenhower during World War II when he saw them, and he spearheaded the creation of interstates in the U.S. in the 1950s. But I digress. The creation of the Autobahns did put a lot of people back to work, but just like the other dictators we've talked about, Hitler does use terror and intimidation. He had the SS, which was his secret police force. Picture of them there, and Hitler inspecting them in the mid-1930s. He also had a group of thugs, essentially, called the Gestapo, that would root out opposition and just scare the mess out of people and intimidate them into not speaking out against the government. Hitler also did indoctrination of the youth, similar to what Mussolini did in Italy. That was done through the Hitler Youth Organization. He bred a generation of young people who were absolutely obedient to him and to Nazi ideals. In terms of culture, he emphasized German culture. He thought that Hollywood was too influenced by the Jews, so he sort of looked down upon those movies, and he looked down upon jazz because it was created by Africans, or people of African descent, which he saw as being inferior races. So German music, like the German operas of Richard Wagner back in the day, he really, really emphasizes those. Racism is obviously a big part of Hitler's regime in Germany. Now, the Holocaust that we often think of, the extermination of Jews in death camps, does not start really in earnest until the 1940s. But the discrimination starts in the 1930s, not long after Hitler takes power. But again, no concentration camps that we really think of today as being these Jewish death camps. The first concentration camp was Dachau, which was opened in 1933, and it was mainly just a place for political prisoners. It wasn't even meant for Jews. But anyway, the Nuremberg laws are put in place in 1935 that placed a lot of restrictions on Jews living in Germany, such as Jews could not marry non-Jews, Jews could not open businesses in some places, Jews could not teach in colleges or universities, so things that just made life more and more difficult for them. And throughout the 1930s, the restrictions on Jews got worse and worse and worse. And what a lot of Jews ended up doing in the late 30s in Germany was they would leave the country and go elsewhere. The prime example of that you may be aware of is Albert Einstein, who ends up immigrating to the United States because things got pretty bad for the Jews in Germany. Unfortunately for the Jews who left Germany and settled elsewhere in Europe, Hitler got to many of them in the end, because Hitler does take over much of Europe and kills millions of Jews in other countries such as Poland. The real beginning of just open warfare on the Jews in Germany, it starts in 1938. There was an incident where a Jewish shopkeeper in Paris killed someone, I think of German descent, and this gave Hitler and the Nazis an excuse to kind of go crazy on the Jews in Germany. And so Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, was born, and it was just a night where Gestapo officers and even random citizens went around and destroyed Jewish businesses, beat Jewish citizens who were out on the streets, and just made things really, really horrible for them. And to add insult to injury, the Nazis made the Jews pay for all of the damage. So you can see the final solution sort of, you can see it coming, you can see the writing on the wall, but it hadn't really started as of the late 1930s. So that will do it for today. We'll be talking about all of these people again as we study World War II. So keep this video in mind and maybe reference it again as we're studying the Second World War. And be sure to watch this in preparation for your test. And as always, ask your teachers if you have any questions. Cheers.